morning. There's a story, text sample, a Methodist, American Methodist minister and storyteller tells. It's about young Billy, 6-year-old Billy. He's in his Sunday school class and his Sunday school teacher is telling the story of Jesus on Good Friday. Jesus being arrested and sentenced and put on the cross. And Billy's heard the story before, but something happens in this hearing, and as she tells the story and the intensity of the story and the pain and the reality of Jesus' suffering grows, so does Billy's intensity. Initially he puts his hand up, and then he's thrusting it, and the other hand, and he's going red in the face, and and as the story builds, so does Billy's intensity, and the teacher keeps reading, and Billy's When she finishes reading, she looks up, and Billy's and she says, "Billy, would you like to say something?" And he says, Miss, if Roy Rogers was there, those baddies he would have fixed it. He would have saved the day." I don't know much about Roy Rogers. He's an American cowboy, I think, and rides into town on his horse with his 6-shooter probably, and saves the day. The innocent victims are held to ransom by the baddies, and Roy Rogers comes in and frees them, and all is good, apparently. I guess I was into other superheroes. A similar kind of story, It's Batman and Robin, Superman, Spider-Man, those sort of people. The baddies come in, and the innocent people are consumed by the baddies and overwhelmed, and in comes the superhero and frees them. There's a spiral of violence escalates through it, and finally the superhero vanquishes the baddies and sends them out. It's a particular story, and in this story that text sample tells, young Billy puts Jesus' story into Roy Rogers' story. He takes the story of Jesus and puts it into Roy Rogers. If only Roy Rogers was there, he would save the day. But Roy Rogers' story is a story of violence over violence. Jesus' story is a peaceful, peace-loving, peacemaking rabbi who doesn't use violence. And so putting Jesus' story into Roy Rogers' story distorts and changes the story of Jesus, as if we put it into Superman or Spider-Man or Batman and Robin's story. What young Billy does is what most of us do a lot of the time. We take Jesus' story, the one we know, and we put it into another story. Sometimes it's our story or our perception of the world, another way of seeing the world. We take Jesus' story and we put it into our story of economics, economic materialism, affluence, aspirational thinking and living, seeking more and more, this growth in materialism, gaining more, putting more focus and emphasis on money. And we read Jesus' story in the light of that. And his story becomes to support what we think. Or we take our political story and we put Jesus' story of politics into that. And we read the political nature of Jesus not as the reign of God, which is over and against all these other powers in the world, but we hear the story of Jesus as a liberal person, or a Labour person, or a Greens, or a Christian Democrats, or a One Nation, or whatever. We read Jesus' politics in the light of our politics, and his story changes. Jesus' story is meant to contain our story, that we put ourselves into the story of Jesus and find a new way of being and living in the world, a new dimension of life and hope and being that transforms us and our world. If we put Jesus' story into us, our story, we transform him into our likeness. And Jesus becomes the one who likes what we like and who we like, and finds as his enemies those we don't like or who are our enemies. We change his story. And we try and do that. People throughout history have tried to do that because his story is not always comfortable or easy. Jesus' story is not an easy one because it invites transformation, change in who we are, in how we see the world and how we relate to one another. It calls for changes in the systems of life and being and how we belong and how we act and live with each other. This week we return to Mark's story of Jesus. And Mark's story is shorter, briefer, more action-packed, fast-paced, and very confronting and challenging. The story comes from chapter 3. And already in these first 3 chapters, Jesus has encountered John the Baptist, been baptised, sent in the wilderness, tempted. He's then gone into the villages around about Galilee and he's proclaimed that the reign of God is here and invited people to turn their lives around and find their story in the story of God. Give themselves into this reign of God, into a new life and being. As part of this proclamation, if you like, Jesus confronts the spirits in people's lives. He's known to cast out demons. The demons and the demonic, I guess in their world, were seen probably something in different ways to the way we in the West might think of the modern Western world. But other cultures would still see them in the same way. But we have our own demons that in just as powerful a way influence and deform our lives. Whether it's grief or guilt or shame, whether it's greed, whether it's hatred, evil, anger, all the different potential demons in our lives. The demons of abuse when people have been abused or post-traumatic stress disorders and things like that from warfare and horrific situations. Those kinds of demons just rattle around in people's brains and minds and beings and threaten them. Jesus released people from this demonic activity in their lives and brought healing. His ministry of healing was about restoration of people. Not just physical healing of the body, but restoration of people back into the body politic, the community. Those who are sick or on the edges, those who live with mental illness, Jesus invited back into the mainstream of life, of the community, and gave them life back and brought them into a place where they could belong. But that challenged some of the social systems of his day. And in this story we read this week, it's one of Mark's sandwich techniques where he starts with one story, interrupts it with another story, and then returns to the original story. And the first part of the story is Jesus is going around doing these healings and preaching and proclaiming and casting out demons, all that sort of stuff. And crowds are gathering around. The people who have need, who are touched and grasped by Jesus, gather around him, and he can't move, and he's gaining attention, and the religious leaders are getting very fed up with him. And his family come and try and draw him away and say, Jesus, come home, this is not good, there's something wrong. You're not seeing the world in the real way. We need you to come home. We need you to stop this. And the point of that is, in Jesus' world, the family was the fundamental social system of people's lives. It was where belonging and structure and honour and respect and the status within society existed. It's where people learned, it's where they held one another. It was the structure that held people tightly and together. I mean, that still happens in many cultures in our world. It's perhaps less so in our Western society, but it's still there amongst some people. But the family was this kind of deep system, institution in people's lives that was most fundamental and basic, the place that they belonged and held them. But then there are other systems around that, the religious system of the synagogue that people went to and belonged to, or part of the village systems or local towns. And then there was a system of the temple which oversaw that, the political religious system of Jewish people, and held the law and the way of God and what was right and wrong and taboo, and the power and politics arose predominantly out of that space. So his family is saying, basically, Jesus, you're bringing dishonour upon us. If you keep going like this, people are going to reject you, and therefore they'll reject us. We don't want that. It would threaten their world, it would break their world open and create deep instability, maybe exclusion, outcast. It was not unknown in various communities, indigenous communities around the world and traditional communities, where a person would go and do their thing and bring dishonour onto their family. They would be killed in order to save their family from shame and to bring respect and honour back. In the midst of this story, as the family are trying to convince him to go home, the religious leaders come. And they start, whilst the family are calling him mad, the religious leaders take him a next step and say, you are evil. You are of Satan or Beelzebul. You are proclaiming and living the way of evil, the way that is opposite to what God is on about. Because you see, we are God's chosen. We are the leaders of God's people. We know. And what you're saying and doing is against what we're saying and doing. You're wrong. And Jesus has, instead of acquiescing, instead of backing down, he confronts them with his parables and his stories and his rhetoric. And he takes it to them and opens them up and reveals their falsehood and brings them into conflict with himself. And then it returns back to the family who are outside the house and who can't get in but are begging him to come out and come home and stop this now. And so you've got these two groups of people trying to bring Jesus down, to stop him. It's kind of like whistleblowers and scapegoats. When Jesus reveals that the system is wrong, that there's evil or injustice in the system will rise up and fight back to maintain the status quo. We see that in all sorts of things. The two Royal Commissions into aged care and institutional child sexual abuse have revealed how institutions, corporations, businesses, schools, churches, scouts groups, aged care organisations will protect themselves, will protect the status quo. Even when evil, gross evil has happened within their midst, they protect the greater good as they see it. And they'll scapegoat people, victims. In the story of the family, it's seen as a sacred thing, and it's still seen as sacred in many people's lives, idolised, the family. And yet we know that it is within family units that some of the most extreme and horrible abuse and violence happens. Is it women are dying at the hands of partners. Too many, far too many. If similar amounts die on the road, we go to all extremes to stop it. Women are dying in homes due to domestic violence. Many are being beaten up. There's psychological, sexual and physical violence towards women, towards children, and also towards men. Some of the violence towards men is psychological and physical as well. And this happens within the home or in the extended family. And it's often silenced. The system is too powerful. The abused child can't speak out or is hushed. Jesus was saying that the systems that we have in place are not good in themselves necessarily, that there is evil. And when there is evil, it flourishes. And when there is injustice, it flourishes. And the status quo, the system, holds what is. And Jesus is saying that's not the way of God. But when the world puts Jesus' story into its story, we try to transform the words of Jesus and justify what we're doing, justify who we are and how we live, instead of taking our story, the world's story, and putting it into Jesus and allowing the grace and love of God to transform us. Jesus will be scapegoated. Jesus would be pushed to the fringes, the margins of life, excluded from temple, excluded from synagogues, and finding his place in homes and public spaces. In that story where the family are outside and Jesus is inside with his crowd of people who are hanging off every word he says, we find a new outside inside. The ones that were inside, the family, are now outsiders. And the outsiders, the ones who are pushed to the fringes and margins of society, are now the insiders around Jesus. And they're the ones who are listening to the way of God and finding life. Whilst those on the outside, family and religious authorities, are trying to scapegoat and take him down, quieten him, silence him, keep him out of the way, so that their story can thrive and his, God's story, will be quietened. I wonder how we respond to that. I wonder how we in our lives listen to the stories of the world and try and put them into God's story. Or how we listen to the stories of the world and try and put God's story into them. What do we do? Do we allow God's story to transform the way we see the world? To the way that we see our homes, our families, our friends, our systems of belonging, the places we belong to? Are we willing to hear and see God in a new way? And have the courage to walk in the way of Jesus, the way of love, inclusion, justice, peace. That's what he invites us to. Will you join the journey with Jesus? Amen.